Audi A4 1.8 turbo engine oil pump replacement. I'm Brian Nessa from How to Automotive. I'm going to show you how to replace the oil pump. It does require a few specialty tools to do this job. I will link them all up in the description of the video. You're going to need an engine support like this, and I have some old seat belts that I use to wrap around the intake manifold and tie them to the hooks on the engine support here. And then I screwed the support down like this and pulled the engine up about a ½ inch or so. Then I got my vehicle racked up on the hoist. Once you got the vehicle racked up, you need to remove the lower splash shields. On this vehicle, they're all missing, but on yours, you should have them, so just remove those. So now I'm gonna drain the engine oil, and I wanted to show you guys these new wrenches that Milwaukee Tools has sent me. They asked me to try them out and feature them for you guys. I will do a full review on these wrenches in a future video. For right now, go ahead and get your oil draining. So after draining the oil, we need to start working on getting the subframe lowered down. So I'm using a transmission jack. I got it jacked up to the bottom of the subframe, and we're going to start removing some bolts to get this to come down. We're not going to take it all the way out. We're just going to lower it down just enough to get the oil pan out. So I'm going to remove the motor mount bolt right here. It's actually a nut. I'm going to remove that. And then on the opposite side, I'll go in there and I'll remove the motor mount nut for that. Then it has these support brackets here, so I'm going to follow them back here to where they end and remove the bolt here at the ends, and I'll do that for both sides. For additional support, I'm going to use a pole jack and a block of wood and jack up the transmission here and support the back of the transmission. So I'm going to leave all the suspension parts still bolted up to the subframe. I'm just going to lower this subframe down, so we're going to remove the main bolts. So we're going to remove the two bolts here, and then there's going to be one back here on the back side of the motor mount, and then we'll follow the sway bar over, and there will be two more bolts here on the front, and then one in the back here. So we're going to remove all those bolts. So after removing the bolts at the front of the subframe, we're going to go back to the back of the subframe and remove the 3 bolts back here, the main bolts holding the subframe in, and we'll do that on both sides. So you'll remove all 3 of these bolts. I also removed the transmission bolt here on the cross member. Now that we got the subframe pretty much all the way unbolted, now what we're going to do is just start lowering the transmission jack here down, and then the subframe will start swinging, it will come down. On the right front corner, there's a wiring harness here that was attached to the subframe that I needed to pop off. It was kind of pulling the wire, so I popped that off. Now I can continue lowering the subframe down, and you just keep lowering it down until it's fully, it's down as far as it goes, and it's literally just hanging by the suspension. Then that'll give you enough gap to get in there and remove all the bolts for the oil pan. We need to remove this tube that's mounted onto the side of the oil pan that goes to the turbo. It's the return line. We're also going to remove this front engine mount that's mounted to the side of the oil pan too. So I'm using a 5mm Allen socket, and I removed those bolts. And I'm also using my new Milwaukee M12 1/4-inch ratchet here to make quick work of that. So I removed the 2 bolts holding the return hose. Then I switched over to a 6mm Allen and removed the 3 bolts holding the front engine mount on. These new Milwaukee M12 ratchets have so much more power and torque. It makes jobs like this really easy and quick. I will be sure to link them up in the description of the video. That way, if you want to check them out, you can find that there. So after getting the mount unbolted, now I'm going to unplug the level sensor. So use a squeeze the tab and pull that off. And then we're going to start removing the 10mm bolts that are around the oil pan. So you'll just follow around the perimeter of the oil pan. There are a couple hidden bolts that I need to point out to you guys. And then at the very back, there's some 16mm bolts that we need to get to also. Once again, I'm using the M12 1/4-inch ratchet to make quick work of that. It's small enough to get into these tight, confined areas. This ratchet is the 1/4-inch drive, and it has 40 foot-pounds of reversible torque. So I just started one spot and worked my way like counterclockwise or clockwise, whichever way you like to work, and just go all the way around until you get back to the same spot and all the bolts are removed. So once you get all the 10mm bolts and the 16mm bolts that you can see around the oil pan, there's going to be 2 more hidden bolts. You're going to need a long extension like this and a 10mm socket, and you're going to go up through this little tunnel here. And there's 2 spots where there's bolts. So you're going to go through these little tunnels here and remove the bolts, but you're going to have to rotate the crank into a certain position to get it, because there's like a little half moon gap that blocks the path. So you have to rotate the crank into a certain position to gain access to the bolt. So if you look up inside the hole, you can see the bolt at the very bottom, but the flywheel is partially blocking the bolt. So what we need to do is put a wrench on the crank pulley here, and we need to rotate that until you get to a position where there's a gap. If you're having a tough time getting the 10mm socket on, you can also use a 5mm long Allen socket like this. And once you rotate the crank till that little hash mark is lined up, then you can insert it and remove the bolt. Once you get the last bolt removed, you can go ahead and drop the pan, and then you're going to pull the subframe down as far as you can, make sure it's clear, and you have to kind of angle the oil pan at certain angles and kind of twist it a little bit, but the pan will come out, it will clear. Now we need to remove the T45 torque bolt on the oil pump sprocket right here. So we're going to back this bolt out. So once we get the sprocket bolt unbolted, then we're going to remove the 10mm bolt here. And then we're going to go on the other side of the pump here, and there's going to be 2 more 10mm bolts here and here. Remove those bolts. To make quick work of that, I'm going to use the M12 again. Once you get the 3 bolts removed from the pump will drop down. And then you can take a little screwdriver and pry the gear off the pump right here, and you can remove the pump from the car. Now you can stick your finger up here and pry the tensioner back like this, and you can remove the sprocket from the chain. Now we need to clean up the surface here for the oil pan residing. So we're going to use scrapers, we're going to use rags, we're going to use brake clean and clean up all the old silicone, all the old oil, everything. And clean everything up as best we can. So here's a closer look at those little slots that we had to line up to get our hidden bolts out right here. These little hash moons right here that I was referring to. So hopefully this helps you guys when you go to take the oil pan down. So you have to rotate the engine till those hash moons line up. Here are the part numbers for the new pump that I'm using, and it also comes with a new pickup screen and O-ring. There will be links for this in the description of the video. We need to remove the sprocket from the new oil pump, so go ahead and remove that center bolt. Once we get the sprocket removed, you're going to see a flat spot on the inside here. You want to pay attention to where that flat spot is. So we're going to put this pump into the car, and you're going to line that flat spot back up with the sprocket and then reinstall it on the inside of the car. So you're going to keep track of where that is, so when you go to put the sprocket on, it's easier to put it on. I actually like to rotate the pump till the flat spot is facing downwards like this. So now we're going to take our sprocket here with the flat spot facing downwards. We're going to slide it up in here and put it in the chain. And you may have to flex the tensioner over to get it to go on. So you're going to hook it on like that. Now you're going to take the pump here and you're going to put it into position. The pump has these dowel pins, so you're going to line those dowel pins up with the bottom of the block here, so you make sure those are lined up, and then you're going to install the pump in like this, and you're going to put your bolts in. So once you get the pump into position, you'll start the 2 front bolts, and after you start the 2 front bolts, you'll take the oil baffle here and put it back up into position, and it mounts onto the back of the pump here. So you'll put it up in position like this, and then you'll start the bolt through the baffle, and then you're going to tighten all 3 bolts down until they're snug, and then you're going to torque all 3 bolts down to 12 foot-pounds. Now we're ready to bolt up the sprocket. Before you do, I recommend that you put some red thread locker on the bolt to help prevent that bolt from backing back out and falling off. So now you're going to line up the flat spot with the flat spot on the pump and put the gear on. You may have to flex the tensioner out of your way to help line it up. Once you get it on there, then you can go ahead and start the bolt. So you're going to run that bolt in until it's snug. And then once it's snug, then you can use a torque wrench, and you can torque the bolt down to 16 foot-pounds. The chain will hold it in place, so you don't have to worry about it rotating. Now we need to install the pickup screen. So you're going to make sure that the O-ring is positioned on there. Then you're going to install the pickup screen in the back of the pump like this, and you're going to start the 2 bolts. You'll have to remove the 2 bolts from the old pump to transfer those over. So go ahead and put those on and torque them both down to 12 foot-pounds. Now you need to clean the oil pan, so you need to scrape off all the old oil, all the old gasket material, which is silicone. So go ahead and make sure that's all clean and get the oil pan as clean as you can get it. Now you're going to wipe down the surface here on the block, make sure it's nice and dry, and then you're going to use a little bit of silicone. I use the right stuff made by Permatex. It works really well. So I'll put a thin layer of that silicone around the oil pan like that. I'll give the mating surface one last quick dry, and then I'll install the oil pan back into the block. I'll make sure that the silicone is in position, and then I'll start all the bolts. So I'll run all the bolts into the oil pan is drawn all the way up to the block and snug, and then I'll go around and tighten all the bolts by hand. So I'll put the hidden bolts on my my Allen socket here and feed it up in there and start the bolts, and I'll tighten those down. So I'll run them in until they're tight, and then about a quarter turn more, and I'll do that for all the bolts. One of the things I like to do is I'll start at one bolt and I'll skip a bolt and tighten the next bolt, skip a bolt, tighten the next bolt, skip a bolt, tighten the next bolt, and I will work my way all the way around the pan, and then all the bolts that I've skipped on the first pass, I'll tighten those up. I also like to use a ratchet just to run it up to it's snug. That way the silicone doesn't get oil dripped in between it, so the faster you can get the pan up and snugged against the block, the better. Now that you got the oil pan bolted up and secure, now the next step is to put the oil turbo drain feed back in. So you're going to install a new gasket. I'll link these part numbers up in the description, and you'll bolt that up to the side of the oil pan with the Allen socket. Then you'll go ahead and plug in the electrical connector for the level sensor. Also, now would be a good time to change out the oil filter there, so go ahead and install a new oil filter. Now we're ready to jack up the subframe back up to the body of the car. So you're just going to slowly do it and line everything up, so you just make sure that everything's lined up, no hoses or wires or anything are being pinched between it, and you'll jack the subframe back up until it lines up with the bolt holes on the body. So you'll work your way around and just make sure that everything's lined up. Now the larger bolts in the middle are recommended that you replace them by the factory. My bolts were on back order, so I didn't have them. So I went ahead and installed with the old mounts. With this car, we'll be back next week for new bolts. I will put links in the description for the new bolts. That way you can pick those up. So once you get all the bolts started, you're gonna slowly jack up the subframe and line up the engine mounts. The engine mount itself are flexible, so you can line up those holes. So you just keep working it until the subframe is completely flush against the body and the engine is sitting back into the subframe. So when you go to line up the subframe, if you look at the old witness marks where the dirt and stuff are around the bolt holes, I try to line those up. I use a pry bar to line those up. Then you can tighten all these bolts down. So there's two shorter bolts on each corner. You're going to tighten those down or torque those down to 55 foot-pounds. All on each corner there's two of the short bolts, so torque those all down to 55 foot-pounds. Then you're going to torque the larger bolts down to 110 pounds. Those are the ones that are supposed to be replaced. So you're going to torque those down to 110 foot-pounds, all four of them. Then after that, you need to put an angle wrench or a breaker bar and rotate the longer bolts 90 degrees. And that's the final torque on it. Now you can remove the pole jack for the transmission and then tighten the crossmember bolt for the transmission down. Now the support bracket at the very end, you can tighten these two bolts down. And after that, you can tighten up the motor mounts. So you're going to run those in until they're snug, and you're going to torque those down to 21 foot-pounds. Now you can reinstall the engine mount that went on the side of the oil pan and torque that down. Then you can put on the lower splash shields, lower the vehicle back down, and remove your cross brace, fill it up with engine oil, put on the top engine cover. After that, you can start the vehicle. And when you first start it, the timing chain may rattle a little bit. It's normal, but it should go away, and the oil pressure light should turn out and you should have good solid oil pressure. So I will link up all the parts and tools that I used in this video in the description. That way, if you need to pick any of those up, you can find those there. I'm Brian Esser from How to Automotive. I'd like to thank you guys for watching my videos. Encourage you to subscribe. Invite you to head over to the howtoautomotive.com website for more valuable videos like this. Thank you again for watching.